Welcome to About Scripture, a podcast designed to take the listener deeper into Scripture and biblical thought. This podcast is brought to you in partnership with Heritage Christian University, where we help students to thrive in ministry. To find out more, go to hcu.edu. We're also partnering with the Ministry League Network. And now, welcome to the podcast. We are in Daniel 9 this morning. This is the last time I will be speaking in chapel this semester. We are not going to finish Daniel. So if you're back next year, maybe I'll finish it then. We've got like 1, 2, maybe lessons to go. I mean, we're in Daniel 9, so obviously there are 3 chapters after that, but those 3 chapters actually all go together. They all fit one big vision. Basically, the vision is really in chapter 11, but chapter 10 is the setup to that, and then chapter 12 is just the conclusion. So they all fit together. So maybe one lesson, but you've got some interesting things in there, some difficult things to talk about. But today it's Daniel 9, and no matter how interesting and difficult the last vision is, Daniel 9 is the most difficult part of the book of Daniel. Difficult in the sense of, what in the world is it talking about? Daniel prays. An angel comes to reveal something to Daniel, and it is the prophecy of the 70 weeks. That is what the angel reveals. We know the name of this angel. It's Gabriel. Gabriel comes, talks to Daniel, and talks to him about 70 weeks. Remember that Daniel had been praying about the 70 years of exile. In fact, you know, what Josh read for us from Daniel at the very beginning of Daniel 9, Daniel is reading. Apparently, he's reading the book of Jeremiah, and he finds where Jeremiah had predicted that the exile would last 70 years. Do y'all know Jeremiah predicted this? Jeremiah 25, Jeremiah 29, both of those passages have that prediction in there. Jeremiah is saying to the exiles in those passages, get comfortable. You're going to live in Babylon for a while. Don't hold your breath. You're never going to see your homeland again. Don't think this is going to be over quickly. It's going to last 70 years. Okay, that's Jeremiah. Daniel, in Daniel chapter 9, he's reading that. And he says, 70 years? Wait a second. I think that's about up. It's time to go home. 70 years is over. And so he starts praying to God about this moment that he is living in. Fulfill your promises. You said we'd get to go home after 70 years. Well, it's been 70 years. Are we going to get to go home or not? How's this going to work out, God? So he starts praying, and an angel comes. Gabriel comes and reveals to him this vision. This is the very end of the chapter. It's the last 4 verses. I'm going to read it to you. 70 weeks are decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint a most holy place. Know therefore and understand from the time that the word went out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the time of an anointed prince, or maybe your Bible says something about a Messiah there. I'm in verse 25. There shall be 7 weeks, and for 62 weeks it shall be built again with streets and moat, but in a troubled time. Is there 7 weeks first, and then we get 62 weeks? Some Bibles actually take them together. There will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and then we'll move on to the next one. So do we take them together or we take them separately? look, when you're studying this passage, like for all passages, but especially for this passage, you got to compare different translations because they're going to group these things differently. Verse 26, after the 62 weeks, an anointed one, or maybe your Bible has Messiah, shall be cut off and shall have nothing, and the troops of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war, desolations are decreed. He shall make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, and for half of the week he shall make sacrifice and offering cease, and in their place shall be an abomination that desolates until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator. Now, y'all have probably heard that passage before, and maybe you have a pretty detailed, worked out interpretation of how you think that goes, where all the weeks fit in, who the anointed ones are. If you read some Bibles, there are maybe 2 anointed ones in this passage. If you read other Bibles, maybe there's only one that's mentioned twice. Maybe you have a worked out idea of who that is and who the princes are. I don't have a worked out idea of this. So I think this is a difficult passage. And when I run up against a difficult passage, I like to get sort of a broad idea of how have people thought about this passage? What different interpretations have people come up with? And what is the reasoning and sort of the motivation behind these different interpretations? And are some of them obviously idiotic that I can just slough off? And do I have some major players here that I can't, I've got maybe 3 or 4 different ways of looking at it that I need to take into account? And when I do that and I come up to the point of saying, man, I don't really know which one is right, I like to sort of stop there. I just like stop at that point and say, I'm not going to latch on to any particular interpretation because I don't know which one is right. So I'm just going to let them all sort of exist, and I will be able to maybe talk intelligently or maybe not so intelligently sometimes about these interpretations and try to help people understand why these different interpretations exist. But I myself don't feel some sort of need to, well, this is the one I have nominated as this is the right interpretation. If I can't like demonstrate it and like bring evidence to it that is persuasive to me at all, then I just let it go. And try to imagine, why has God given us such a passage if I can't figure out what it means? And I sometimes find that that is a more fruitful, theologically, devotionally, a more fruitful way of approaching a tough nut like the prophecy of the 70 weeks. Let me commend that approach to you. It might also, temper some tempers. I didn't mean to make that pun, but there it is. There's a lot to say about it. I'm not sure how much to say about this prophecy at this moment, but let me just jump into my document here. Our chapter in Daniel starts with Daniel reading the words of another prophet, Daniel 9:2. He's reading Jeremiah. The number 70 years as the time span of the exile comes up a couple of times in the book of Jeremiah. Let me give you the exact verses. I mentioned the chapters earlier. Jeremiah 25, verses 11 and 12. And then also Jeremiah 29, verse 10. Now, that is its own set of problems, because the exile did not last precisely 70 years. And it's hard to know exactly how long it did last. Like, if you actually count up the exile, it's hard to know when are you supposed to start counting, even. Like, when are we going to say the exile started so that we know when to count? And then when did it end? That's a little easier. But it's hard to even crunch that number, and that number is definitely an easier number to crunch than the 70 weeks that comes up with Gabriel. There were, in fact, multiple waves of exile. The last chapter of the book of Jeremiah mentions 3 waves of exile. That's Jeremiah 52. One in the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar, that would be about 597 BC, Jeremiah 52, verse 28. Another wave of exile in Nebuchadnezzar's 18th year, so that'd be about 586 BC, that's Jeremiah 52, verse 29. And then another wave of exile in Nebuchadnezzar's 23rd year, so that would be about 581 BC, Jeremiah 52, verse 30. The second wave of exile that's 586 BC. That is when the temple was destroyed and the Davidic monarchy came to an end. The first wave, that's 597 BC, is when King Jehoiachin was taken to Babylon and his uncle, Zedekiah, started to reign in Judah. It is from this event, the exile of Jehoiachin, that, for example, Ezekiel's prophecies are dated. So see Ezekiel 1, verse 2. The exile came to an end when Cyrus the Great, king of Persia, conquered Babylon and allowed the various peoples to return to their ancestral lands. That year was 539, 538 BC. According to Ezra 1:1, this was the moment to which Jeremiah had been pointing in his predicting the end of the exile. So an exile that starts in 597 BC and ends in 538 BC gets us about 60 years of exile. Is that how we're supposed to count it? Some people have tried to make it more precisely 70. If you take the length of time in which the temple is destroyed, you do get about 70 years there. That's about 586 BC when the temple was destroyed. About 516 is when it was rededicated. That's 70 years. It doesn't seem like that's what Jeremiah was talking about, the temple. It seems like he was talking about the people being displaced from their land. But, you could do it that way if you wanted. And then the other sort of wrinkle here is that Daniel, at the very beginning of the book of Daniel, mentions an exile that is otherwise unattested in all of history, or in the Bible, certainly. That is, Daniel, it says that Daniel himself was taken into exile in the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim, who is Jehoiachin's daddy. And so this would be something like the year 606 BC. Well, if you wanted to count from there, like 606 to 538, 539, that's getting really close to 70 there. So maybe we should take Jeremiah's prediction of the 70 years of exile as a precise number. And that's, even though it's a little off, 68 years or something like that. My tendency, I've already sort of told you how I do biblical interpretation, and my tendency would be to say, I don't want to press the number. I think what Jeremiah was doing was just saying, you're never going to see your homeland again. Get over it. Stop holding your breath. Plant some gardens, build some houses. This is your home now. But don't give up complete hope, because your grandkids are going to go back to Jerusalem. They're going to have, and was it, 60 years? Was it 90 years? It doesn't really matter. 70 years was just this number that he threw out to say, you're never going back to your homeland, but your grandkids are. And I think that number accomplishes that, however you crunch it. And I don't even worry about crunching that particular number. If that's the way I approach Jeremiah's 70 years of exile, I will go ahead and tell you that's something close to that is also how I approach Gabriel's 70 weeks. All right, so let's fast forward to that. Look, we got to skip Daniel's prayer just for time's sake. We're skipping Daniel's prayer. It's a pretty good prayer, and you definitely ought to read it and think about it. But we're going to go ahead and go to the angel now. In response to Daniel's prayer, asking God to remove Israel's sin in light of the end of the promised 70 years of exile, God sends the angel Gabriel to inform Daniel that God will indeed remove sin. But he has a different timetable in mind. Not 70 years, but 70 weeks. And you might think, isn't 70 weeks like a whole lot shorter than 70 years? 70 weeks is like, what is that? Like a year and a half or less than that? Well, that is part of the weirdness of this passage. We'll get to that in a minute. You probably already know the weeks are weeks of years, or at least that's the common thought. The 70 weeks in this passage, as we've already seen, the 70 weeks are divided up into 3 periods. This is what Gabriel says. There's a 7-week period, and there's a 62-week period, and then there's the final week at the end of it all, 1 week. And that final week is actually divided into 2 as well. There's the first half of the final week and the second half of the final week. But maybe there's only 2 big periods. And this depends on, are we supposed to understand the 7 and the 62 weeks as one big chunk, basically 69 weeks, and then you have a final week over here? Or are we supposed to take it as 3 periods, 7 weeks, and then we got 62 weeks, and then we got 1 week? Well, different people take it different ways. I will say, I think in my experience, conservative Christians prefer to take it as 2 chunks rather than 3 chunks. They want to take the 7 and the 62 as one big chunk of time rather than dividing it out. I will say, from my perspective, that is not the obvious way of reading the passage. But the motivation there, I think, is to get the numbers to crunch. Because if you take 7 and then 62 as 2 separate things, the numbers don't work. Or maybe they do, but they don't work for anything that we want them to work for, right? All right, so it's difficulties. All right, so you've got these chunks of time, and some things are going to happen during these weeks beyond simply God's removal of sin. Gabriel's revelation is a little difficult to follow, but it seems to describe a period of suffering for God's people, and we've seen this before, an anointed person, or maybe 2 anointed people, and something called the abomination of desolation. Let me say it again. This is a difficult passage. I don't know what it all means. There are some passages in the Bible that are like arithmetic. 2 + 2 = 4. They seem pretty straightforward, easy to interpret. This is not one of those passages. Daniel 9 is not an arithmetic passage. It is a calculus passage. In 2 different ways, actually. This is not the passage you come to when you're starting out in Bible study. This is one you get to after you've already been studying the Bible for some years. That prior study doesn't mean you're going to understand this passage, but it will give you a basis for thinking about its meaning. All right, let's go to something on which everyone seems to agree. In this passage, week, 70 weeks, week equals week of years. So 7 years. The idea that we might group time into 7-year periods is not that unusual in the Bible. Think about the sabbatical year, which, as different passages in the Bible show, had some bearing on the length of time of the exile. There's also the Jubilee year, remember, which is the year after a series of 7 sabbatical years, or 7 Sabbaths of years. Leviticus 25, verse 8. Other ancient Jewish writings sometimes counted time in generations rather than years, and they would talk about a group of 7 generations as a week So you got these different things. It's not, I mean, it's weird talking about 70 weeks, but the weeks are actually weeks of years. I think that's weird, but if you put it in the context not only of just ancient Jewish literature, but even the Bible, more specifically, it happens other places. Something close to it happens other places. All right, so if Daniel 9 is talking about 70 weeks of years, that is 70 7-year periods, then the total would be 490 years. But are we supposed to take this literally, as if God is giving us a timeline that we should calculate? Or is 70 weeks more symbolic? Sometimes the Bible uses numbers symbolically. When Jesus says you should forgive someone not 7 times, but 77 times, nobody takes it literally. In regard to Daniel 9, conservative Christians usually have tried to take the 490 years literally, at least in my experience. Maybe you know something different. But there are problems with this approach. There are problems with any approach, and the issues are so complex that the passage is best studied verse by verse. We don't have time to do that this morning. I will say, though, that I lean toward the idea of taking the 70 weeks sort of symbolically, or at least as so complicated that God doesn't really intend for us, or for Daniel, to calculate the period indicated by the 70 weeks. That is, I think Gabriel's revelation is intentionally obscure. We're not supposed to crunch the numbers. He has given it to us in so complex a fashion that we can't possibly crunch the numbers anyway. All right, let me fast forward. Obviously, there are all kinds of ways of understanding the passage. Does it lead up to Jesus? Is he the anointed one in the passage? The anointed one who is cut off? I think that's verse 26. Yeah, maybe. I mean, try to get those numbers to work. All right. Are you going to try to crunch the numbers to get the 400, or let's say the 483? Because you got a final week in there. Is the crucifixion a part of that final week, or is it after the final week, or is it before the final week? But if let's say 490, if you're going to get the crucifixion to hit year 490, when are you going to start counting? Like you get what Gabriel says is you're supposed to start. The 70 weeks begins at the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Well, I would have thought that was Cyrus's decree. Wouldn't you have thought that? The decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. But I've already told you when that happened. That was 538. Let's say 538 BC. Well, if you take 490 years off that, you're not getting into AD time periods, right? You're still in the BC time. So what, are you just going to make up a time? Well, let's just start counting so that we end up at AD 30 as the 490th year. Okay, well, that's a way of going. You could do that. It just doesn't seem very convincing to me. You're sort of stacking the deck, to make sure you end up with what you wanted in the first place. Okay, that's only one. Look, ancient Christians knew this was, they read the passage and they said, well, that's a hard passage. So already Jerome wrote a commentary on Daniel in the year 407 AD. Okay, that's a long time ago. And he already said, I'm not going to tell you what I think the passage means. I'm just going to tell you what other people have thought the passage meant. And he chronicled 10 different interpretations, mostly from Christians, one Jewish interpretation as well, but 10 different interpretations, like this guy says it means this, and this guy says it means that. He even has 3 different interpretations from the same guy. You've heard of this guy, Eusebius, the church historian, and Eusebius does indeed give 3 different interpretations. 2 of the different interpretations take the prophecy as winding up with the crucifixion, Jesus, but one of Eusebius's interpretations takes the prophecy as winding up with like one of the Hasmonean high priests, like 200 years before the time of Jesus. So Eusebius is like, I don't know. You could take it this way. You could take it this way. Maybe it's about Jesus. Maybe it's not about Jesus. I can't do any better than that. I mean, they didn't know what it meant. I don't know what it means. That doesn't mean, I think, that we are completely hopeless here. So let me move on. Oh, man, the time. I'll say it again. I don't know how to work out the details. The numerous proposals for interpretation surely indicate that no definite interpretation can possibly be offered. I personally prefer to go with what I know. And when it comes to the prophecy of the 70 weeks, what I know is that I don't understand it. Maybe God intended it that way? What if God sent Gabriel specifically to confuse Daniel, to unveil this complicated series of weeks in which all kinds of things would happen, but to unveil it in such a way that no one could possibly calculate when it would come to pass? At the same time, the prophecy offers assurance that God has a timetable in mind. It's just a timetable that he knows and we don't. If that's the case, then God intended for the calculation to be hard or baffling, impossible. He did not intend for us to be able to figure out how to do the calculation. So there is no point in trying to figure out when to start counting. Is it at Cyrus's decree, or before that with Jeremiah's prophecy, or after that with Artaxerxes? The answer is none of the above, because we're not supposed to count. There is no need to get the numbers to work out. There is need only of praising God for taking care of our greatest problems on his timetable. No one could have taken this prophecy and worked out when the events described in it were going to take place. We know that for sure, because over the millennia, people have tried again and again, and they've been proven wrong each time. I think the main idea, if I haven't said it enough, of Daniel's prophecy, the 70 weeks, is that God has his own timetable for working things out. But there are also some other points we can derive from this passage. Things are not going to get better immediately. Or at least that's what Gabriel wanted to tell Daniel. It's going to get worse before it gets better. God is in control. Human rulers are not in control. God has a plan for bringing an end to sin. That's what I get out of the prophecy of the 70 weeks. Thank you.